We were four college friends looking to escape the stress of finals. It was supposed to be a weekend of camping, swimming, and drinking by a secluded lake deep in the woods. Just us, nature, and no cell service. Something we all thought sounded perfect. The drive was almost 5 hours, and the last stretch was on a winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the water. It was stunning, a hidden gem surrounded by thick trees with no other campers in sight. Exactly what we wanted. We set up camp close to the lake, pitching two tents and starting a fire. The first night was perfect. We cooked hot dogs, drank cheap beer, and shared ghost stories until the fire burned low. The lake was so still, it reflected the moon like a mirror. By midnight, we all crawled into our sleeping bags and passed out. The next morning, while we were cooking breakfast, we noticed something strange. Across the lake, just on the edge of the trees, there was smoke like someone else had a campfire. We hadn't seen or heard anyone when we arrived, and it was weird to think someone else was out here in such a remote spot. Probably just some hikers, Ben said, shrugging it off. The smoke was dark, not the clean white you'd expect from a normal campfire, and whoever was there didn't come over to say hello, which was unusual for fellow campers. By midday, curiosity got the better of us. We decided to hike around the lake to see who else was out here. The trail was overgrown and winding, but after about 30 minutes, we found it. A small clearing with a fire pit and a group of people sitting in a circle. There were 6 of them, all wearing beige robes with hoods on covering their faces. They didn't look up when we approached. They just sat there in silence, as if they were waiting for something. In the center of the circle was a wooden structure almost like an altar, with strange carvings on it. The air felt heavy and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Hey there," Lisa called out nervously. "We didn't mean to intrude, just wanted to say hi." One of them finally turned their head toward us slowly. The face under the hood was a man's face, but his expression was cold, almost blank looking. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, husky voice. "Okay, sorry," Lisa stammered. "We'll leave you to it." As we turned to go, another one of them stood up. "Wait," she said. Her voice was a lot sharper than the man's. "You can't leave yet." That was enough for me. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Lisa's arm. The others followed, and we walked quickly back to our campsite, not looking back. My heart was racing the whole way. By the time we got back, the sun was dipping low in the sky. We all agreed it was time to pack up and leave. Whatever was going on across the lake, we all knew that we didn't want to stick around to find out. But as we started to tear down the tents, we realized something chilling. Our stuff had been moved. The tents were unzipped, our bags had been rifled through, and some of our food was gone. "They were here," Ben said in a shaky voice. We threw everything into our backpacks as quickly as we could. The plan was to hike back to the car and get the hell out of there. But as we started down the trail, we noticed something horrifying. Symbols. Strange looping patterns had been carved into the trees along the path. They weren't there when we came in. The carvings got more frequent the further we went, and soon after that, we started to hear something. At first, it sounded like the wind, but then we realized it was chanting. Low, rhythmic, and it was getting louder. Panic set in. We started running, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the trail entirely. The chanting was all around us now, echoing through the trees. And then we saw them, the people in the robes emerging from the forest like shadows. They didn't chase us. They just stood there watching as we stumbled past them. When we finally reached the car, the windows had been smashed and the tires were slashed. The chanting had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. "Just drive!" Lisa screamed. Ben jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. We sped down the dirt road, the rims screeching against the gravel, praying the car would hold up. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway, which was miles away from the lake. We reported what happened to the local authorities, but they didn't seem to take us seriously. "Probably just some weirdos messing with you," the deputy said with a shrug. But we knew it was more than that. Those people weren't just campers or pranksters. They were something else, something dangerous. To this day, I can't hear chanting without my stomach twisting in knots. I'll never go back to the woods again. The Philippines had always been Jessica's dream destination, an escape from her boring city life. It was a chance to immerse herself in nature and an opportunity to challenge herself. One of the highlights of her trip was a solo hike deep in the rural mountains. Locals warned her to stick to the main path and be back before nightfall. An elderly innkeeper at her hostel told her, in broken English, "The forest has secrets. You don't go there." She'd smiled politely but brushed it off as she thought it was just the locals trying to scare tourists. The trail was even more stunning than she imagined. Towering trees arched, birds chirping, and the scent of Earth's natural smells. Jessica felt a thrill from being so far from civilization. She hiked for hours, stopping occasionally to snap photos and take in the beautiful views. By mid-afternoon, something shifted in the energy of the woods. The birds' chirping stopped abruptly, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The cheerful energy she'd felt earlier was replaced by a strange heaviness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. Even though Jessica felt something wasn't right, she ignored her gut instinct and continued on with her adventure. As she reached for her water bottle, she heard a faint crunch of leaves behind her. She turned quickly, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. She thought it an animal, so she kept walking. Minutes later, the sound of the leaves crouching came again. This time it was sounded much closer. She stopped in her tracks. At this point, her heart was beating out of her chest. She called out in trembling voice, "Hello!" But there was no reply. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, and Jessica decided to head back. But the trail, which had felt so clear earlier, now seemed unfamiliar. Panic bubbled in her chest as she realized she'd taken a wrong turn. The crunching sound returned. It was accompanied by the faint rustle of branches. She spun around, and for a split second, she thought she saw something, a pale figure between the trees. Her stomach dropped as she remembered the stories about the aswang the locals were telling her before she left. They said a aswang was a shape-shifting creature that hunted in the forest, luring travelers deeper into the woods with voices that sounded like their own. A low, bird-like sound broke the silence. Jessica froze. Then she slowly turned her head. In the dim light, she saw something that looked tall, impossibly thin, and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. It let out a wet, choking noise while its twisted mouth curling into a horrible grin. Jessica's survival instincts kicked in. She ran as fast as she possibly could, her feet pounding against the uneven trail. Behind her, the sound of the heavy, uneven footsteps grew louder. It was following her, and it was fast. She tripped and fell, scraping her knees, but quickly scrambled back up. She was fueled by pure adrenaline. The forest seemed endless, with no end in sight. Her legs burned and her lungs felt like they would burst, but she didn't stop. Just when she thought she couldn't go on, she saw the faint glow of lanterns in the distance. Jessica screamed for help desperately. A door flew open, and an elderly man stepped out, yelling for her to get inside. She stumbled into the small house, collapsing onto the floor as he bolted the door behind her. His wife stood nearby, with Jessica sat there as pale as a ghost. "Did it see you?" the man asked in broken English. Jessica nodded. She was shaking uncontrollably. The man exchanged a grave look with his wife. "You are lucky," he said. "Most who see it do not return." The villagers guarded her that night, taking shifts with machetes in hand as they watched the tree line. Jessica didn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the creature's glowing eyes and twisted grin. The next morning, the villagers escorted her out of the area. They were constantly scanning the forest. Before she left, one of them warned her softly, "Not everything in the forest can be explained, and not everything should be." Even in the safety of her own home, Jessica can't shake the memory of that night. She dreams of the creature, and the thing that terrifies her most, the knowledge that the locals spoke of it like it was a fact of life, something they'd lived with and accepted. Growing up, I always loved the woods. It was a place where I could breathe freely away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. I've hiked countless trails and camped in remote areas. I honestly felt more at home surrounded by trees than I ever did in the city. But after what happened last year, I can't look at the forest the same way again. It started as a weekend trip. My friend Dan and I had been talking about exploring a section of forest deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't an official trail, just a series of old logging roads that eventually disappeared into untouched wilderness. The area had a reputation among locals as uncharted and remote, which only made it more appealing to us. We wanted the challenge and the chance to experience something few others had. We packed light, Only our tents, enough food and water for 3 days, and the usual gear like knives, compasses, flashlights, and a portable GPS. The first day was uneventful. We followed one of the logging roads for several miles before cutting into the forest to set up camp. The night was peaceful, filled with the familiar sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. The next morning, we ventured deeper into the forest. The fresh air thickened and the terrain grew rougher. Around midday, we stumbled upon something strange, a clearing that didn't look natural. The ground was uneven with patches of grass that looked like it had been walked on recently. In the center was an old rusted oil drum lying on its side, surrounded by scattered debris. There was a torn sleeping bag, a few empty cans, and what looked like the remains of a fire pit. It didn't make much sense. Who would camp this deep in the woods, and why leave it in such a mess? Dan shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the bad feeling he had about this. Something about the scene felt wrong, like we were intruding. I ignored his gut feeling and we pressed on, thinking it must have been some careless hiker. By late afternoon, we found a good spot to camp near a small stream. As we set up, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual forest sounds of birds, insects, even the wind seemed to have vanished. Dan joked that it was because we were so far out, but I didn't laugh. The silence was unnerving. That night, we were woken up by the sound of movement. It wasn't close, but it sounded deliberate. Branches snapping and leaves crunching. Whoever or whatever was out there weren't trying to be quiet. Dan grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent, muttering something about deer. I stayed put. My heart was racing as I listened. When Dan shone the light into the trees, the sound stopped. He called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But there was nothing but silence. Then after a few seconds, the sound resumed, moving further away. Dan came back into his tent, shaking his head. "Probably an animal," he said, but his tone didn't match his words. He sounded uncertain and maybe even a little scared. The next day, we decided to head back. Neither of us admitted it outright, but we both felt like something wasn't right. The woods, which was once inviting and full of life, now felt hostile. As we retraced our steps, we noticed things we hadn't seen before. Faint trails that seemed to lead nowhere, deep scratches on tree trunks, and what looked like an old rusted trap partially buried in the ground. Around midday, we passed the clearing again. This time it looked different. The debris was still there, but the oil drum had been moved. It was upright now, and the fire pit looked freshly disturbed, like someone had been there since we'd first seen it. Dan and I exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't stop. We just wanted to get out. The final stretch back to the logging road was the worst. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, the silence broken only by our hurried footsteps. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, and I could tell Dan was just as on edge. When we finally reached the truck, we didn't say a word. We just threw our gear in the back and left. I've thought about that trip a lot since then. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself there was nothing out there but animals and maybe another camper. But deep down, I know that's not true. Something was out there watching us. I haven't been back to the woods since. I miss it sometimes, the peace and beauty of nature. But every time I think about going back, I remember that feeling of the heavy silence, the distant sounds of movement, and the unmistakable sense that we weren't alone. I've always enjoyed the outdoors. There's something liberating about leaving the noise and chaos of the city behind and venturing into the wilderness. I've camped dozens of times with friends, but last summer I decided to challenge myself. A solo trip, just me, my gear, and the quiet solitude of nature. I spent weeks planning. I chose a spot in the mountains about 40 miles from the nearest town, a location that promised isolation and stunning views. The trail was unmarked, but I'd mapped everything out in detail. My pack was carefully assembled with all the essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, a sturdy tent, and a GPS. I even brought a satellite phone just in case of an emergency. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours. The road was rough, but my old SUV handled it fine. By the time I arrived, it was late morning. I parked at the edge of an overgrown dirt road, locked up, and started hiking. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a light breeze, and just warm enough to make the climb pleasant. The trail quickly disappeared into dense forest, and I relied on my GPS to guide me. By mid-afternoon, I reached my destination, a small clearing near a crystal clear stream. It was picturesque, the kind of place you see on postcards. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. Everything felt perfect and was exactly as I'd hoped. That night, after a simple dinner of instant noodles, I sat by the fire and stared up at the stars. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful and felt almost surreal. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent, sipped myself into my sleeping bag, and was ready to go to sleep. I woke up to a sharp cracking noise. At first I thought it was a dream, but then it came again. The sound of a branch snapping. My eyes flew open and my heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, trying to calm myself. It's probably just a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon. But then I heard footsteps. They sounded heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. I froze, my hand gripping the knife so tightly it hurt. The footsteps circled my tent, slowly crunching on the dry leaves. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper? A park ranger? But why wouldn't they announce themselves? "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard a deep voice. "Didn't mean to scare you," the man said. "Just passing through." Relief flooded me for a second, but it didn't last. What was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? "All right," I said, trying to sound casual. "You're pretty far out for a hike." There was no response. The footsteps resumed, heading away from my tent, and eventually faded into the distance. I sat there for what felt like hours, knife still in hand, listening for any sign of movement. When I was sure he was gone, I lay back down, but there was no chance of me falling asleep. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. The encounter had shaken me, but I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he really was just passing through. I still couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I dismantled my tent and stuffed everything into my pack. The hike back to my car was uneventful, but my nerves were on edge the entire time. Every sound made me jump. By the time I reached the dirt road where I'd parked, I was exhausted, but my relief turned to panic when I saw the SUV. The driver's side window was smashed and the door was slightly open. I approached cautiously. My heart was pounding. The interior was a mess. My glove box had been ripped open, and the emergency supplies I'd left inside, a flashlight, a spare knife, and a small amount of cash, were gone. But what sent a chill down my spine was the note left on the driver's seat. It was written on a torn scrap of paper, and all it said was, "Next time, I won't just pass through." I threw my pack into the back, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people. I reported the break-in to the local sheriff, but there wasn't much they could do. The area was so remote that there were no cameras, no witnesses, and no way to track whoever had been out there. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Was he just a drifter looking for supplies? Or was it something more sinister? I'll never know. But I do know one thing is that I won't be going back into the woods alone again.